All Saints' Day is observed on November 1st after All Hallows' Eve, otherwise known as Halloween, but we celebrate it on the first Sunday in November. How do you define a saint? Oxford has two main definitions. A person acknowledged as holy or virtuous and typically regarded as being in heaven after death. And B, a very virtuous, kind, or patient person. My definition of a saint is a person who has lived their lives set apart in this world as a servant of God. They are ones whose practice of faith inspires my own. It's been a unique year for me, as you might imagine. While it wasn't my intention, I could argue that this year has been a time of engaging with the saints in my life. Certainly, I have a greater appreciation for them. As I shared briefly last week, being in the catacombs in Rome, then at the burial places of Peter and Paul, I was speechless. It moved me deeply, especially the latter two. I mean, you don't read of the apostles' deaths in the Bible, so those details were unknown for most of my life. Only in seminary did I get to hear stories and read short descriptions about them. And as such, these stories became more like legends, and I never gave them their due thought for seriousness. And then all of a sudden, very suddenly, there I was standing at these sites, these figures, these people, these icons that I had studied, learned from, and tried to be like. These legendary figures became very real, tangible. And along with it, the seriousness of their faith, their conviction that led to their martyr, also became very real. These were no longer tales and legends. This was history. And in their presence, none of what I had done or what I do as a disciple of Christ seemed close to their example. And in that moment, they became true saints to me. I've always referred to them as Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter, but in my heart now, I have this desire to call them Saint Paul and Saint Peter. And it's not to push them out so far that it's no longer becomes possible to live like them, but to know in my heart, in my mind and soul, that it is absolutely possible to live out the gospel in this radical way. They inspire me. I was inspired earlier this year. I went to Korea with the goal of learning as much as I could about my family. I think the benefit of the grant was not just in the resources it provided, but also the context that it came with. My relatives, who knew the purpose of the grant, well, they were not shy about their stories. And I had known some of them for all of my life, but never had heard the things that they were sharing. These were much more personal ones that they felt now was a good time to share. And it was particularly good to hear about my paternal grandfather. He passed before I was born, and all I knew about him had come by way of others. The funny thing is that whenever someone would speak about my grandpa, they would tell me what a great singer he was, or what a great volleyball player he was, or what a great trombonist he was, or what a great table tennis player he was. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that every person that I have ever met who knew my grandfather would point out either his musicianship or his athleticism. Even this year, earlier this year, I had a opportunity to speak with a retired Korean clergy who came out of Detroit and now lives in the Valley, who happens to know or knew my grandpa. He grew up in the church that my grandfather pastored. Small world. And he told me, again, how great an athlete my grandfather was. Now, having heard this for 40 years or so, I began to interpret this by thinking that, well, perhaps Grandpa Cho, with all due respect, though he was a pastor, he must have not been a very good one. All the examples people tell me are about his extracurricular activities and never about how great a pastor he was. And I guess in my 21st century ears, it sort of sounded like that one pastor who was really great at golf. Like he could have been a professional golfer, but he chose to do ministry instead. But all he did was play golf, even in ministry. And in my mind, my grandfather became the equivalent of the golfer pastor. Well, on this pilgrimage, my father asked me kind of openly, so what would you like to know? What do you know about your grandfather? And so I told him, frankly, how I felt, how I was led to believe that perhaps he was not a very good pastor because of everything that people were saying, or specifically everything that people weren't saying. And my father got a big laugh out of it. Then he set the record straight with me. Grandfather was an extraordinary pastor. He was a great preacher. The conference at the time made tape recordings of his sermons to share with those who could not receive an appointment of a pastor. They would play his audio tapes. This was at a time when Korea was very poor. Creating such a tape recording itself was really unique. He was a great church planter too, at least half a dozen churches that still exist this day. He just happened to also be very talented in music and in sports. And Grandpa used his talent in music and sports to draw people and to draw people in and to build up the church. He had this charisma. There's a story of him planting a church. He went around villages to draw people together, but he needed a place where everyone could gather, where everyone could find it with ease. So where did he pick? A riverbed or at some open field? Nope. He invited people to hike up a nearby mountain. They gathered at the top. No one would get lost because everyone eventually arrived at the summit. Now, I wonder, would any of you meet with me if I asked you to join me on Sundays atop of South Mountain? I don't know, right? But the amazing thing is, they came. They went every Sunday up that mountain. And on their way down, they brought down a large stone, each of them, eventually using those rocks, literally, to build that church. I think I shared a picture of that church a year ago. Stories like this were inspiring to me. And it was also inspiring to see my father telling me stories about his grandpa with such pride and joy. Truth be told, and I want to be honest because I think it only makes sense. I had never seen myself as someone who could draw in people. It may be an immigrant's complex or some insecurity rooted in Asian masculinity. I'm sure it was both, and I can see that now. But what I want to say is I've found it difficult to see myself as someone who could draw people in, as someone people wanted, or as someone who had something to offer that people desired. It was a dull spot in my ministry. But hearing about Grandpa and how he was able to draw people to God, it led to a greater appreciation for my choness. I began to see my grandpa like a saint, not just because he died as a Christian, but really because of the way he lived, set apart for God and how he fulfilled his calling. You know, it just so happens to be that the founder of the Methodist movement, John Wesley, he also loved All Saints' Day, and I can see why. Spending a Sunday to recall our saints and remember how they have formed us is really good for the soul. It's medicine. We do have new saints this year. It is both an honor and privilege to have known them in this life. And it's my utmost joy that our saints are now all joined together. In our reading, the Apostle John's revelation, well, we see that it speaks of a time when the coming of Christ, when Christ is seated at the throne, and all those who had passed before us are gathered together for worship. It says that there is a multitude, a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. I just love this vision. It's perfectly heavenly, literally. I mean, I have tearfully happy moments when I think about people like Bruce Burns and my grandfather, both whom I've never met, only those I've only heard stories about, who are now together with God, just being completely awesome as they are. I am equally moved when I think about my paternal grandmother who loved me so dearly, now able to visit with Doris Stanley and Sandy Spurcali. They were all nearly the same age. I can see them chatting at the heavenly banquet, free from cultural barriers, free from language barriers, just enjoying each other's spirits and perhaps together looking down at me with their loving, caring eyes. It's funny to think about the cultural dynamics. I'm pretty sure that I've shook or held Doris or Sandy's hands more than I have held my own grandmother's. The assembly of all our saints, intertwined in the great compassion and love of our Lord Jesus Christ, held in the very presence of our God, should cause all of us to celebrate with great and exceeding thanksgiving. Perhaps equally, if not more inspiring, is that this is what awaits all of us when at long last we too join in that banquet. But before you pass it up to someday or one day eventually, the true gift and purpose of celebrating All Saints Sunday is that even as we proclaim that we are who we are because of those who have gone before us, we also give thanks for and celebrate the saints who are still with us. Collectively, we are all saints. We are those who will be, I hope, considered saints by those who follow us in this community. We should celebrate each other, the ways in which we are all striving to live our lives as holy ones, set apart from this world in service to our God. And I am so very honored to serve you as a pastor. You know, around the time that I was sensing the need for renewal, I asked God why I was here. I mean, serving a church in America that with people that were mostly much older than I. I didn't get it. And it wasn't because I was unhappy, but because I was unclear as to what God was trying to do in and through me. For instance, I thought, well, why doesn't God lead me to serve a church in Korea, closer to my family? Why doesn't God lead me to serve a progressive multi-ethnic church in Seattle or in New York with young families like my own? I was wrestling with these questions. But then, during the renewal, I had time to consider, well, who, in fact, I really was. As someone who grew up not knowing either of my grandfathers, who lived an ocean apart from my grandmothers, my aunts, my uncles, even my own parents, I grew up missing them very dearly. I missed them, present tense, dearly. I missed their spiritual presence. But because of this, my heart had developed a soft spot, an ache for a generation older than my own, to love them and care for them and to be in their midst, as I longed to be in the midst of my own family members. Whereas some of my colleagues around my generation may find it a challenge to have a 2 or 3 hour conversation with someone they consider a grandparent, I indulge in that moment. All that to say, I celebrate all of you. I am honored to serve you as a pastor and to walk this stage of life with you. I serve a community of living saints. You know, we're getting new name badges. Everyone should be getting new name badges. On our badge, outside of our name, there's a line that we can self-describe ourselves. And some people might say, you know, they're really into baseball or where their hometown is or what are their interests. I feel like mine should read Reverend Paul Cho, Senior Pastor of the Living Saints, at Tempe first. Today is a celebration of the life and ministry of our church. We held our 135th charge conference yesterday. What a blessing just to be able to say that. We are only here today because of all the saints that have come before us. Interestingly, as an integral part of Tempe's historic community, you can easily find photos, older photos of our church community online. The Tempe Historic Museum features pictures of our historic churches, the two other buildings before this one. And it's fascinating to see these spaces, this building, continuously serving to be the church of every nation, all tribes and people. It's something worth celebrating. And I would encourage you to search online and find for yourself if you're tickled by old photos. Perhaps you might even recognize few of the faces there. As you celebrate this day for the life and ministry of our church, may we also consider the unique time setting we are placed in. You know, there was a time when Tempe was just forming itself to be a city. We as a church was already formed, established, open before the city of Tempe was even incorporated. And with the growth of the city, the church also grew. We shifted and adapted with the city as its surroundings, shifted from agricultural to residential, growing with the influx of families, especially as the academy here shifted from a state college to a state university. And then the academy grew to surround us, and what was once residential became, either school property or now commercial property. And we seem to have become locked in to this urban landscape. And so we are ripe for a time of discernment on how we will grow and adapt into this new reality of ours. Meanwhile, the facility that we have inherited from the sweat and labor of our saints, it has its own requirements, its own upkeep that we must maintain. Everything has a lifespan, even when we do our best to maintain them. We learned of this similar cause last year with the organ as it began to fail and why we had to refurbish it. We are currently learning of our HVAC unit in the sanctuary. It is dying and we cannot repair it. We need to replace the two units, and the cost is quite large. Some estimates say that it will be perhaps twice as much as it cost us to refurbish our organ. How are we to respond to this and other needs? Will we simply just stop worshiping here once these units are out? Doesn't make sense for us to think and grapple about these. We have to be here. We have real need, and it will take a substantial investment for us to meet those needs. In Rome, I was stunned by the beauty, the magnitude, the dedication I saw at these sacred sites. I mean, the Basilica at St. Peter, the Basilica of St. Peter in the Vatican. I'm floored, awe-inspiring. I walked the entire tour with my jaw opened. I don't share that to rally us into having some kind of Da Vinci type sculpture. It's inspiring, but that's not the inspiration that I was feeling. Mine was more indirect. It came from the revelation that these places, these sacred spaces, they were not always areas to behold. They were really grasslands near the walled city of Rome. Think about, whether or not you'd like to own property near a graveyard, and you see what I began to meet. These weren't significant places. Peter never thought so highly of the place that he would end up being buried. It was all those who came after, who longed to show their dedication and affirmation for Peter's faith, that came together to honor such a place. And I was being inspired by that hidden community, generations of nameless servants that had come to take care not of the building per se, but the story and the legacy of the ministry and mission of St. Peter. And so, who are the saints that have formed you? What are the stories that matter to you? And how will you enable that legacy to stand? On this month of stewardship, I trust that you know that our leadership works diligently and faithfully with all the resources you give to Tempe First. We are right now discerning how to be best stewards of the church we have inherited. And it is a blessing to have a physical space, a place to gather and have our ministry. It's a blessing for many faith communities that right now still have to meet in schools or at parks because they have no physical space. And it's a blessing for even faith communities to have a space, a place to worship, even if they are burdened by a mortgage. We are blessed because we owe nothing. Everything you see in this space that you are able to see if you visit here, they've been gifted by saints past and those who are alive right now. It is time for us to discern then what gift we shall leave for yet another generation. Throughout the month of November, I ask you to pray and respond. How might I respond to this call God has placed? And I would invite you to respond generously, to honor the saints with what they had left us in their gift, to honor them with our faith, to honor them as we seek to develop saints for yet another generation. On this All Saints Sunday, may we be ones who live set apart from this world as living saints in all that we do, in all that we say, and in how we offer ourselves to God and each other. Amen.